The phone rang at 2:47 a.m., piercing through the silence of our Pearl District loft like a siren. Nathan bolted upright beside me, his hand already reaching for the device before his eyes were fully open. I watched through half-closed lids as he glanced at the screen, his face illuminating in the blue glow. Without a word, he slipped from our bed and padded barefoot to the living room, closing the bedroom door behind him with careful precision. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This had been happening for 3 months now. Always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Always the same urgent whisper of his voice through the walls, too muffled for me to make out words. Always the same explanation when I asked the next morning. Work emergency. Crisis with a client. Time zone differences with overseas projects. But CrossTech Solutions was a local consulting firm. Their biggest client was a Portland-based manufacturing company. What overseas emergency could possibly require Nathan's immediate attention at nearly 3 a.m. on a Wednesday? I lay there listening to the familiar rhythm of his hushed conversation, counting the minutes. 15. 20. 23 minutes of animated discussion before I heard his footsteps returning. The mattress dipped as he settled back into bed, and I felt his body remain rigid beside me, sleep clearly eluding him. Everything okay? I whispered into the darkness. Just Marcus needing approval on some code deployment, he replied, his voice tight. Go back to sleep, Claire. Marcus Vale, Nathan's supervisor at CrossTech, the company psychologist who had somehow transitioned into overseeing technical operations. I'd met him twice at company functions, and something about his calculating gaze had left me unsettled. The way he studied people, as if cataloging their weaknesses for future reference. When I first met Nathan Thornton 4 years ago at a sustainability conference in downtown Portland, he was everything I thought I wanted. Brilliant software engineer with a passion for environmental technology, gentle humor that could make me laugh during my most stressful days at the marketing firm, and an authenticity that felt rare in our increasingly digital world. He listened when I spoke about my dreams of running ethical marketing campaigns for companies that actually made a difference. He remembered small details about my day and surprised me with my favorite coffee on mornings when I had particularly challenging presentations. Our courtship unfolded like something from a romantic film. Weekend hikes through the Columbia River Gorge, farmers market visits where he'd carry my canvas bags and debate the merits of various heirloom tomatoes with elderly vendors. Quiet evenings in bookstores where we'd read passages aloud to each other. Nathan introduced me to his world of sustainable technology, explaining how his work at CrossTech was developing software solutions to help companies reduce their environmental footprint. I shared my vision of marketing that told authentic stories rather than manipulating consumer desires. When he proposed 18 months later during a sunset walk through the Japanese garden, presenting a ring with a recycled diamond set in reclaimed gold, I thought I'd found my person. Someone who shared my values, understood my ambitions, and wanted to build something meaningful together. The wedding was intimate, held at a restored warehouse in the Arts District, with locally sourced flowers and a menu featuring ingredients from Pacific Northwest farms. Nathan's colleagues from CrossTech attended, including his supervisor Marcus Vale and the company founder Vivian Cross. I remembered being struck by how articulate and commanding Vivian was, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her handshake firm enough to convey decades of business acumen. She spoke passionately about CrossTech's mission to revolutionize how companies approached environmental responsibility through technology. Nathan is one of our most valuable team members, she told me during the reception, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder. His dedication to the work we do is extraordinary. I hope you understand how important his contributions are to our larger mission. At the time, I'd felt proud that my new husband worked for someone who clearly valued his talents. Vivian Cross had built CrossTech from a small consulting practice into a firm with contracts throughout the Pacific Northwest. Her reputation in Portland's business community was impeccable, and she'd received numerous awards for her commitment to sustainable business practices. Nathan and I settled into married life in a converted loft apartment, with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. I continued working as marketing director at Henderson Creative, managing campaigns for local nonprofits and sustainable businesses. Nathan threw himself into his projects at CrossTech with renewed energy, often staying late to perfect code or attend strategy meetings with international clients. For the first 2 years, our life together felt like the organic extension of our courtship. Nathan would come home energized by his work, eager to share breakthrough moments in developing new algorithms or successful implementations with clients. We'd cook dinner together, experimenting with recipes from the cookbook collection we'd started during our engagement. Weekends meant exploring Portland's endless network of food trucks, brewery visits with friends, or longer adventures to the Oregon coast. Nathan's passion for his work was infectious. He'd explain complex technical concepts with such enthusiasm that I found myself genuinely interested in software architecture and environmental data analysis. When CrossTech won a major contract with a renewable energy consortium, Nathan spent an entire evening walking me through how his team's software would optimize wind farm operations across 3 states. His eyes lit up as he described the potential environmental impact, sketching diagrams on napkins while our pasta grew cold. "This is exactly why I got into this field," he said that night, reaching across our small dining table to take my hand. "We're not just writing code, we're actually making the world better." I loved seeing him so fulfilled by work that aligned with his deepest values. When I mentioned this to friends, they'd smile knowingly and comment on how lucky I was to have found someone so passionate about meaningful work. Nathan's dedication seemed like the perfect complement to my own career, building ethical marketing strategies. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. The first change I noticed was Nathan's sleep patterns. He'd always been an early riser, up by 6 a.m. to exercise before work, but he started waking multiple times during the night. Initially, I attributed this to stress about a particularly complex project he'd mentioned involving data security protocols. When I suggested he might benefit from some relaxation techniques, or perhaps talking to someone about work stress, he brushed off my concerns with a tight smile. "It's just a challenging phase," he said, already reaching for his laptop. "Once we get through this implementation cycle, things will calm down." The implementation cycle stretched from weeks into months. Nathan's midnight restlessness became routine, and I grew accustomed to feeling him slip quietly from bed to work in the living room. Sometimes I'd find him in the morning, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, asleep on the couch with his laptop balanced precariously on his chest. When I'd wake him gently, he'd startle, as if emerging from a dream he couldn't quite remember. His conversation patterns shifted as well. Where Nathan had once shared detailed stories about his workday, his responses became increasingly vague. When I asked about specific projects or clients, he'd give generic answers about troubleshooting code or attending meetings. The technical explanations that had once flowed so naturally seemed to require visible effort, as if he was translating from a language he no longer spoke fluently. "How did the presentation go with the Renewable Energy Consortium?" I'd ask, remembering his previous excitement about the project. "Fine. They approved the next phase," he'd reply, already turning his attention to his phone. "What's the next phase involve?" "More of the same. Data optimization. Algorithm refinement." These conversations felt like trying to catch water in a sieve. The Nathan who had once sketched software architecture on napkins now seemed to have difficulty articulating what exactly he did all day. When I pressed gently for more details, a shadow would cross his face, and he'd mention being tired or having a headache. The mysterious late-night phone calls began during this period of increasing withdrawal. At first, they were sporadic. Maybe once a week, Nathan would receive a call that required him to leave our bedroom for hushed conversations that lasted anywhere from 10 minutes to over an hour. His explanations were always work-related, always urgent, always involving some crisis that required immediate consultation. "Sorry about that," he'd whisper upon returning to bed. Marcus needed input on a security patch. Time-sensitive client situation. I wanted to be understanding. Nathan had always been conscientious about his work, and if his expertise was needed during off hours, that seemed like a testament to his value as an employee. But as the calls became more frequent, occurring multiple times per week and always during the deep hours of night, my understanding began mixing with concern. Nathan's behavior during daytime hours grew increasingly distant. He'd sit at our kitchen counter with his coffee and laptop, but instead of the focused energy I'd grown accustomed to, he seemed to be staring through the screen rather than at it. When I'd speak to him, there was often a delay before he responded, as if he needed a moment to process that someone was addressing him. "Nathan? I was asking about dinner plans for tonight." He'd blink, refocusing his attention with visible effort. "Dinner? Right. Whatever you think is good." The Nathan, who had once debated the merits of different cooking techniques and insisted on reading restaurant reviews aloud before choosing where to eat, seemed to have lost all opinions about food, entertainment, weekend plans, or any other aspect of our shared life. His responses became automatic, pleasant but empty, as if he was operating from a script designed to avoid conflict rather than expressing genuine preferences. Our physical relationship changed as well. Nathan had always been affectionate, reaching for my hand during movies or pulling me close while we cooked together. But his touch became perfunctory, mechanical gestures that felt more like remembered behaviors than spontaneous expressions of intimacy. When we made love, which happened with decreasing frequency, Nathan seemed present but detached, going through motions without the emotional connection that had characterized our relationship.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I tried addressing these changes directly, choosing a quiet Sunday morning when we were both relaxed and unhurried. "I've been worried about you lately," I said, settling beside him on our couch with 2 cups of coffee. "You seem stressed, maybe overwhelmed with work. Is there anything I can do to help?" Nathan looked up from his laptop, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm fine, Claire. Just busy with some complex projects. Nothing to worry about." "The late-night calls have been happening pretty regularly. That must be exhausting, being on call all the time." "It's part of the job. CrossTech has clients in different time zones now. International expansion means being available when they need support." This was the first time Nathan had mentioned international clients, despite his previously detailed sharing about all aspects of his work. When I asked which countries they were working with, his explanation became vague, mentioning something about European manufacturing companies and Asian tech firms, without providing specific details that had always characterized his work stories. "Maybe you should talk to Vivian about setting some boundaries," I suggested. "Even dedicated employees need reasonable work-life balance." Nathan's reaction was immediate and startling. His face went pale and his hand tightened around his coffee mug with enough force that I worried it might crack. "Vivian knows what she's doing," he said, his voice sharper than I'd heard it in months. "CrossTech's success depends on being responsive to client needs. I can't just decide to be unavailable when the company needs me." The intensity of his reaction seemed disproportionate to my mild suggestion. When I tried to continue the conversation, Nathan closed his laptop abruptly and announced that he needed to go for a run. He was gone for over 2 hours, and when he returned, he behaved as if our conversation had never happened. I began paying closer attention to Nathan's patterns, not from suspicion but from genuine concern about his well-being. He was losing weight, his clothes hanging more loosely on his previously athletic frame. Dark circles had appeared under his eyes, and he'd developed a habit of massaging his temples as if fighting constant headaches. His normally excellent memory seemed compromised. He'd forget plans we'd made, conversations we'd had just days before, or details about upcoming events that had previously excited him. When I suggested he see a doctor for a general checkup, Nathan agreed with surprising compliance. But after the appointment, he reported that everything was normal, just some stress-related symptoms that would resolve once his current work projects stabilized. He'd been prescribed some vitamins for energy and told to improve his sleep hygiene. The prescribed vitamins appeared on our bathroom counter in an unmarked bottle. When I mentioned that most doctors provided labeled prescriptions, Nathan explained that Dr. Vale had recommended a specific brand that he'd picked up directly from CrossTech's wellness program. Marcus Vale, his supervisor, was apparently qualified to make health recommendations in addition to overseeing software development. "Marcus has a background in occupational psychology," Nathan explained when I expressed surprise, "part of CrossTech's holistic approach to employee wellness. Vivian believes in addressing the whole person, not just work performance." This explanation struck me as unusual, but Nathan's delivery was so matter-of-fact that I questioned my own reaction. Perhaps progressive companies did take more comprehensive approaches to employee health. Vivian Cross had certainly emphasized work-life integration during the conversations I had had with her at company events. As autumn progressed into winter, Nathan's transformation became more pronounced. He moved through our daily routines with robotic efficiency, completing tasks without apparent engagement or pleasure. Conversations required increasingly specific prompts to elicit responses beyond monosyllables. He'd stopped initiating any activities, whether social plans with friends, weekend adventures, or even simple decisions about what to watch on television. Yet paradoxically, Nathan's work performance seemed to be flourishing. He received recognition for several major projects, including a commendation from Vivian Cross, that resulted in a significant salary increase. When I congratulated him on this success, he accepted my praise with polite gratitude, but without the enthusiasm such achievements would have previously generated. Vivian says I'm becoming exactly the kind of employee CrossTech needs for its next phase of growth, he told me that evening, his voice strangely flat for someone describing career advancement. What does that mean exactly? What kind of employee? Dedicated, reliable, focused on company priorities above personal distractions. The phrase personal distractions hit me unexpectedly. Was I a personal distraction? Were our marriage and life together impediments to Nathan's professional development? When I asked for clarification, Nathan seemed confused by his own words, as if he'd repeated something without fully processing its meaning. The Christmas party at CrossTech provided my first opportunity in months to observe Nathan in his work environment. The event was held at the Heathman Hotel, elegantly decorated with sustainable ornaments made from recycled materials, reflecting the company's environmental commitment. Vivian Cross moved through the gathered employees and their partners like a gracious hostess, stopping to speak personally with each couple. When she reached Nathan and me, her attention focused entirely on him. "Nathan, you look wonderful. The new regimen is clearly agreeing with you." I glanced at my husband, trying to see what Vivian saw. To me, Nathan looked thinner, more tired, less vibrant than he had months earlier. But Vivian's assessment seemed genuine, her smile warm as she studied his face. "The whole team has noticed the improvement in your focus and productivity," she continued. "Marcus tells me you're responding beautifully to the enhanced support protocols." Enhanced support protocols. Another phrase that sounded corporate, but conveyed no actual information. When I asked Nathan about it later that evening, he seemed unsure what Vivian had been referring to, suggesting it might have meant the additional training sessions he'd been attending. "What kind of training?" I asked. "Professional development, leadership skills, stress management techniques." These training sessions were apparently why Nathan had been leaving for work earlier and returning home later. They explained the blocked-out time on his calendar and the days when he seemed particularly exhausted. But when I asked about specific skills he was learning or techniques that were helping him, Nathan's responses were vague, as if he was describing something he'd heard about rather than experienced directly. The mysterious phone calls continued throughout the winter, increasing in frequency to nearly every night. Nathan's responses became so automatic that he often answered before the first ring completed, as if his subconscious was perpetually listening for the sound. His conversations grew longer, sometimes extending past an hour, and his whispered voice carried an urgency that seemed inconsistent with routine work consultations. One February morning I woke to find Nathan standing motionless in our living room, still dressed in pajamas, staring out the window at the river. His posture was rigid, his face completely blank, as if he'd been placed there and forgotten. When I called his name, he didn't respond. When I touched his shoulder, he startled violently, as if waking from a trance. "What time is it?" he asked, disoriented. "Almost 7. You were just standing here. Are you feeling okay?" Nathan looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, his confusion genuine and alarming. "I don't remember getting up. I must have been sleepwalking." He'd never mentioned sleepwalking before, and the episode seemed less like unconscious wandering, and more like some sort of dissociative state. When I suggested he mention this to his doctor, Nathan agreed, but later reported that Dr. Vale had explained it as a stress response that would resolve with continued treatment. Dr. Vale, Marcus Vale, the supervisor who made health recommendations and prescribed unmarked vitamins, the man who conducted training sessions that Nathan couldn't describe, and implemented support protocols he couldn't explain. As winter gave way to spring, I realized that the Nathan I'd married was disappearing piece by piece, being replaced by someone who looked identical but felt like a stranger. He still performed the basic functions of being a husband. He remembered to kiss me goodbye in the morning and hello when he returned from work. He participated in conversations about household logistics and weekend plans. He maintained our shared checking account and contributed to household chores. But underneath these surface behaviors, Nathan had become hollow. His laugh sounded mechanical. His expressions of affection felt rehearsed. His responses to questions seemed to come from a limited script, designed to avoid deeper inquiry. The man who had once stayed up until midnight explaining the environmental impact of different coding languages now struggled to articulate what he'd accomplished during an 8-hour workday. The phone calls at 2:47 a.m. had become as reliable as an alarm clock. Nathan would answer before the first ring completed, slip out of bed, and disappear into the living room for increasingly lengthy conversations. His explanations the next morning never varied. Marcus needed consultation, crisis management, international client emergencies. But as I lay awake listening to the muffled rhythm of his voice through our bedroom door, I began to notice that Nathan's tone didn't sound like someone providing technical expertise. It sounded like someone receiving detailed instructions, responding with brief acknowledgments, asking for clarification on complex directives. It sounded like someone being programmed. The thought arrived unbidden and felt so dramatic that I immediately dismissed it. Nathan was clearly under significant work stress, probably dealing with demanding clients and an overwhelming project load. The late-night calls were inconvenient and disruptive, but that didn't mean anything sinister was happening. Vivian Cross ran a respected company with an excellent reputation. Marcus Vale was a licensed professional, providing workplace support. Yet as I listened to another 2:47 a.m. call extend past the hour mark, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man whispering urgently in our living room was no longer the Nathan I'd married. He was someone else entirely, wearing Nathan's face and living Nathan's life, but fundamentally altered in ways I couldn't yet define. Something was happening to my husband, something that went far beyond work stress or career demands. And as the digital clock beside our bed glowed 3:52 a.m., and Nathan's voice continued its urgent whispered responses to whoever was on the other end of that mysterious call, I realized that I was going to have to find out exactly what that something was. Because if I didn't, I might lose Nathan completely to whatever force was systematically erasing the man I loved, and replacing him with this hollow, programmable stranger who shared his name but none of his soul. The decision to investigate came on a rainy Thursday morning in March, when I found Nathan standing in our kitchen, fully dressed for work, staring at the coffee maker with complete bewilderment. He'd been standing there for over 10 minutes, motionless, as if he'd forgotten what the appliance was for. "Nathan?" I approached carefully, the way you might approach someone sleepwalking. "Are you okay?" He blinked slowly, refocusing his attention with visible effort. "Coffee. I was making coffee." "The machine isn't turned on." He looked down at the cold, empty carafe as if seeing it for the first time. "Right. Of course." His movements were deliberate but uncertain as he went through the familiar motions of adding water and grounds, his muscle memory carrying him through a routine his conscious mind seemed unable to access. This wasn't stress. This wasn't exhaustion. This was something else entirely. I waited until Nathan left for work before I began my research. Working from home that day gave me the privacy I needed to explore the growing list of inconsistencies that had been accumulating in my mind. I started with CrossTech Solutions, examining their website with the critical eye I'd developed through years of marketing work. The company's online presence was professionally designed but oddly vague. Their services were described in broad terms like innovative technological solutions and, quote, comprehensive consulting frameworks, without specific examples of actual products or methodologies. The client testimonials were generic, praising CrossTech's transformative approach and revolutionary thinking, without mentioning concrete results or specific projects. Most troubling was the staff directory. Nathan was listed as a senior software engineer, but his bio contained none of the detailed project descriptions or technical specializations that typically characterized such positions. Instead, his profile mentioned, quote, dedication to organizational excellence and, quote, commitment to integrated solution development. These phrases could have described any employee in any field. Marcus Vale's profile was even more peculiar. His title was listed as Director of Human Development, with a background that somehow encompassed both psychology and technical oversight. His credentials mentioned degrees from prestigious universities, but when I searched for his published research or professional affiliations, I found virtually nothing. For someone supposedly qualified to make medical recommendations and conduct psychological training, Dr. Marcus Vale had remarkably little academic footprint. Vivian Cross, by contrast, had an extensive online presence. Articles about her business philosophy, interviews discussing sustainable technology, awards for corporate social responsibility. But as I read through years of her public statements, I noticed a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Her language consistently emphasized concepts like optimal human performance, behavioral integration, and systematic personal development. These weren't typical business terms. They sounded more like clinical psychology or behavioral modification. I spent the afternoon researching behavioral modification techniques, initially out of curiosity but increasingly with a growing sense of dread. The academic papers I found described methods for altering human behavior through systematic reinforcement, conditioning protocols, and environmental manipulation. Some of the terminology was disturbingly similar to phrases I'd heard Nathan repeat when describing his work training and support protocols. That evening, I watched Nathan with new attention. His movements had a mechanical quality, as if he was following an internal checklist rather than responding naturally to his environment. When I asked about his day, his responses were generic and oddly formal. I completed several high-priority assignments and participated in ongoing development sessions with Marcus, he said, his tone professional rather than conversational. What kind of assignments? System optimization projects, code refinement initiatives, strategic implementation protocols. These weren't the words Nathan would have used 6 months ago. The man who had once explained complex technical concepts with enthusiasm and specificity now spoke in corporate jargon that conveyed no actual information. When I pressed for details, he seemed genuinely confused by my questions, as if I was asking him to explain something he'd heard about rather than personally experienced. The phone call that night came at exactly 2:47 a.m., as it had every night for weeks. But this time, instead of trying to ignore it, I lay perfectly still and listened with focused attention. Nathan's side of the conversation was barely audible through the bedroom door, but I caught fragments that chilled me. Yes, I understand the importance of compliance. The behavioral adjustments are taking effect as planned. No resistance to the new protocols. Ready for the next phase of conditioning. Conditioning. The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Nathan was discussing his own conditioning as if it was a routine work process. Whatever was happening to him, he was not only participating willingly, but reporting on his own psychological transformation to whoever was on the other end of those calls. I waited until Nathan returned to bed and his breathing settled into the deep rhythm of sleep before I carefully extracted myself from the covers. Our home office was in the converted loft space above our bedroom, accessible by a narrow staircase that I climbed with extreme caution. Nathan's laptop sat closed on the desk, but I knew his password. We'd always shared computer access, a remnant of our early relationship transparency. The screen illuminated the small space as I opened his email client. What I found there defied everything I thought I knew about my husband's work life. Nathan's recent emails were filled with communications from Marcus Vale that read more like therapy session notes than professional correspondence. Nathan, your progress continues to exceed expectations. The reduction in external questioning behaviors has been particularly notable. Continue the evening meditation protocols and maintain minimal social engagement outside essential work relationships. Excellent work suppressing resistance responses during today's conditioning session. Your compliance scores have improved 23% this month. Dr. Cross is pleased with your dedication to the program. Dr. Cross. Vivian Cross was apparently also a doctor, another credential that hadn't appeared in any of her public materials. And Nathan was participating in something called conditioning sessions that involved compliance scores and resistance suppression. I scrolled further back through Nathan's emails, looking for the beginning of whatever process had transformed my husband. The shift in communication style was dramatic and clear. 6 months ago, Nathan's emails had been conversational, filled with technical details and enthusiastic collaboration with colleagues. Then, gradually, his messages became shorter, more formal, eventually reducing to brief confirmations and acknowledgments. More disturbing were the scheduling emails from Marcus Vale. Nathan's calendar had been systematically restructured over the past months. Traditional work activities like team meetings and project planning had been replaced with sessions labeled personal development, behavioral integration, and cognitive restructuring. These appointments occurred multiple times per week, often extending for hours. A folder labeled Treatment Progress contained documents that made my blood run cold. Nathan's psychological state was being monitored and documented with clinical precision. Reports tracked his emotional responses, social interactions, and what was described as, quote, resistance to directive compliance. Charts showed his progression through something called the optimization protocol, with markers for different phases of psychological adjustment. One document, dated just 2 weeks earlier, contained an assessment that destroyed any remaining doubt about what was happening to my husband. Subject continues to demonstrate excellent response to behavioral modification interventions. Original personality characteristics have been successfully suppressed with minimal breakthrough episodes. Memory of pre-treatment preferences and relationships shows desired degradation. Subject now prioritizes organizational directives over personal desires in 94% of observed interactions. Recommend proceeding to Phase 4 of the conditioning protocol. Subject. They were referring to Nathan as a subject in some kind of psychological experiment. His personality was being systematically destroyed and replaced with something that prioritized organizational directives over his own authentic desires. The Nathan I'd married was being erased piece by piece, replaced by a programmable shell that looked like him but contained none of his actual self. I photographed every document with my phone, my hands shaking as I navigated through folder after folder of evidence. Nathan wasn't just under work stress. He was the victim of a sophisticated psychological manipulation program designed to transform him into some kind of corporate automaton. And, based on the clinical documentation, this transformation was nearly complete. A sound from downstairs froze me in terror. Nathan was moving around the bedroom, his footsteps deliberate but quiet. I quickly closed all the email folders and shut down the laptop, listening as he padded to the bathroom and then returned to bed. Had he noticed my absence? Was he trained to report any unusual behaviors during his nightly check-ins? I waited an hour before carefully making my way back downstairs, slipping into bed beside the man who was no longer entirely my husband. Nathan's breathing was regular, but his body felt different beside mine. Where he had once unconsciously curled toward me in sleep, he now lay rigid and separate, as if even his unconscious mind had been programmed to maintain professional boundaries. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching everything I could find about psychological manipulation in corporate environments. The information I discovered was more extensive and disturbing than I'd expected. Sophisticated behavior modification programs were apparently more common than most people realized, typically disguised as employee development or performance optimization initiatives. I found academic papers describing techniques for gradually altering personality traits, suppressing undesirable behaviors, and installing new response patterns through a combination of psychological conditioning, environmental manipulation, and pharmaceutical intervention. The unmarked vitamins Nathan had been taking suddenly took on sinister significance. What if they weren't vitamins at all, but mood-altering substances designed to make him more susceptible to psychological programming? CrossTech's employee wellness program began to look very different through this lens. The company's emphasis on holistic employee development wasn't progressive human resources policy. It was a systematic method for gaining psychological control over their workforce. Nathan wasn't being trained for better job performance. He was being transformed into something barely human. I needed evidence that would stand up to scrutiny beyond my own growing paranoia. Working in marketing had taught me the importance of documentation and verification. If I was going to help Nathan, I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed as the concerns of an overly suspicious wife. That afternoon, I drove to the public library and used their computers to research Marcus Vale and Vivian Cross more thoroughly. What I found suggested their backgrounds were more complex than their professional profiles indicated. Marcus Vale had indeed worked in psychology, but his early research had focused on behavioral modification techniques for correctional institutions. His published papers described methods for suppressing aggressive behaviors and installing compliance responses in prison populations. Vivian Cross's academic background included a PhD in industrial psychology with a specialization in workplace behavior modification. Her early career had involved consulting work with corporations interested in what she called human resource optimization. Several of her research papers discussed techniques for identifying and reshaping employee personalities to better serve organizational goals. Together, they had developed what they called the Integrated Personnel Development Model, a systematic approach to transforming employee behavior through controlled environmental manipulation, psychological conditioning, and chemical intervention. CrossTech Solutions wasn't just their current business venture. It was a real-world laboratory for testing and refining their human modification techniques. Nathan was one of their test subjects. The implications of this realization overwhelmed me. If CrossTech was conducting unauthorized psychological experiments on their employees, Nathan wasn't their only victim. How many other people were being systematically transformed into corporate automatons? How many families were watching their loved ones disappear into hollow shells, programmed for optimal workplace compliance? I spent the evening researching legal remedies for psychological manipulation and corporate abuse. The legal landscape was complicated, partly because many victims of such programs wouldn't recognize what was happening to them, and partly because proving psychological manipulation required evidence that was difficult to obtain. Nathan's own emails would be crucial, but I needed more than documentation of the program's existence. I needed proof of its harmful effects and evidence that it was being conducted without genuine informed consent. That night's phone call provided my first opportunity to gather audio evidence. I used my phone to record Nathan's side of the conversation, positioning myself just outside the bedroom door where I could capture his responses without being detected. What I heard confirmed my worst fears about the systematic nature of his programming. Yes, the medication is maintaining optimal receptivity levels, Nathan said in his flat, emotionless tone. No breakthrough memories from the pre-treatment period. Relationship bonds continue to weaken as planned. Ready for accelerated conditioning protocols. Relationship bonds continue to weaken as planned. They weren't just transforming Nathan's work behavior. They were systematically destroying his capacity for personal relationships, including his connection to me. Our marriage was being deliberately undermined as part of their psychological modification program. I recorded similar conversations over the next week, documenting Nathan's reports on his own psychological transformation. Each call provided more evidence of the systematic nature of CrossTech's employee modification program. Nathan discussed compliance scores, resistance levels, and progress markers as if he was a machine being fine-tuned rather than a human being with autonomous thoughts and feelings. During the day, I began subtly testing Nathan's responses to see how thoroughly his original personality had been suppressed. When I mentioned places we'd visited together during our courtship, he showed no emotional response to memories that had once brought him joy. When I played music he'd previously loved, he listened with polite disinterest. When I tried to engage him in conversations about environmental issues that had once passionated him, he responded with generic corporate talking points about sustainable business practices. The Nathan I'd married was still physically present, but psychologically he'd been almost entirely replaced by this program substitute. Yet occasionally, brief flickers of his authentic self would break through the conditioning. A moment of confusion when he couldn't remember why he'd entered a room. A flash of genuine emotion when he looked at our wedding photos. A brief, spontaneous laugh that sounded like the man I'd fallen in love with. These breakthrough moments gave me hope that Nathan's original personality might still exist somewhere beneath the layers of programming. If I could gather enough evidence to expose CrossTech's illegal activities, perhaps the psychological damage could be reversed. But I was running out of time. Nathan's conditioning was accelerating, and each week brought more evidence that his authentic self was being permanently erased. I needed help from someone with expertise in psychological manipulation and corporate abuse. After extensive research, I found Dr. Patricia Kim, a forensic psychologist who specialized in cases involving coercive control and workplace psychological abuse. Her published research included several cases of employees who had been subjected to unauthorized behavior modification programs by their employers. Meeting Dr. Kim required careful planning. I couldn't risk Nathan or anyone at CrossTech discovering my investigation. I scheduled the appointment during Nathan's longest conditioning session, using a false name and paying in cash to avoid creating any digital trail that might be traced back to me. Dr. Kim's office was in a converted house near the University District, warmly decorated but equipped with recording equipment for documenting testimony from abuse victims. She listened to my story with professional calm, occasionally asking clarifying questions about Nathan's symptoms and behavioral changes. "What you're describing sounds consistent with systematic psychological manipulation," she said after I'd finished explaining the situation. "The gradual personality changes, the compliance behaviors, the memory suppression, these are all characteristic of sophisticated behavior modification programs." I showed her the photographs I'd taken of Nathan's emails and the audio recordings from his late-night phone calls. Dr. Kim's expression grew increasingly grave as she reviewed the evidence. "This is extensive and well-documented psychological abuse," she said finally. "What CrossTech is doing to your husband appears to be a form of systematic personality destruction and reconstruction. It's similar to techniques used in extreme cult environments, but applied in a corporate setting." "Is it reversible?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me for weeks. "Potentially, but the longer it continues, the more difficult recovery becomes. Some aspects of personality modification can be permanent, especially if they involve chemical intervention or trauma-based conditioning techniques." Dr. Kim explained that helping Nathan would require extracting him from the controlled environment and providing intensive therapeutic intervention to counteract the programming. "But first, we needed to document the full scope of CrossTech's activities and gather evidence that could be used to shut down their operations and help other victims. You're going to need law enforcement involvement," she said. "What you've described constitutes criminal psychological abuse, potentially involving multiple victims. But gathering sufficient evidence will require careful coordination to avoid alerting the perpetrators." She referred me to Detective Angela Rodriguez, who specialized in corporate crime and had experience with cases involving psychological manipulation. Detective Rodriguez worked with a federal task force that investigated sophisticated white-collar crimes, including those involving human trafficking and coercive control. Meeting with Detective Rodriguez felt like crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. Once I involved law enforcement, I was committed to seeing this investigation through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal cost. But as I listened to Nathan's increasingly mechanical responses during our dinner conversation that evening, I realized that the man I'd married was already gone. My choice was between accepting his transformation or fighting to get him back. Detective Rodriguez reviewed my evidence with the thorough attention of someone who had seen similar cases before. She was particularly interested in the systematic nature of the psychological manipulation and the apparent involvement of multiple CrossTech employees. "This looks like a sophisticated operation with multiple victims," she said. "We'll need to move carefully to avoid alerting them before we can gather additional evidence and identify other targets." She explained that building a case against CrossTech would require coordination with federal agencies, given the potential scope of their activities and the likelihood that they were operating in multiple jurisdictions. She also warned me that the investigation could take months, and that Nathan's condition might worsen before we could intervene effectively. "Your husband is going to need extensive therapeutic support once we extract him from their control," she said. "And you should prepare yourself for the possibility that some aspects of his personality changes may be permanent." As I drove home from that meeting, I realized that my life had fundamentally changed. I was no longer just a concerned wife dealing with a husband's work stress. I was now an active participant in a criminal investigation targeting the people who had systematically destroyed the man I loved and replaced him with a programmable shell, Nathan was waiting for me when I arrived home, sitting in our living room with his laptop open, staring at the screen with vacant concentration. He looked up when I entered, his expression polite but empty. "How was your day?" he asked, the question delivered with mechanical courtesy rather than genuine interest. "Fine," I replied, studying his face for any flicker of authentic emotion. "How was yours?" "Productive. I completed several optimization protocols and received positive feedback on my compliance metrics." He had no idea that I now knew exactly what those words meant. He didn't realize that I understood he was reporting on his own psychological destruction as if it was career advancement. The Nathan who would have been horrified by what was happening to him had been so thoroughly suppressed that he couldn't even recognize his own victimization. But I recognized it. And I was going to fight to get him back, even if it meant destroying the people who had stolen him from me in the first place. The opportunity to expose CrossTech came sooner than expected. Detective Rodriguez called me on a Friday afternoon, with news that would change everything. "We've been monitoring their communications," she said, her voice tense with urgency. "CrossTech is planning something they're calling a, quote, demonstration event for potential new clients. It's happening tomorrow night at the Pearl District Convention Center. We think they're going to showcase their behavior modification program using current subjects." My stomach dropped. "Nathan will be there." "Almost certainly. According to the intercepted communications, they're presenting what they call their quote, optimization success stories to a group of corporate executives interested in implementing similar programs. Your husband appears to be one of their primary examples." The thought of Nathan being displayed like a trained animal to prospective buyers filled me with rage and desperation. But it also presented the perfect opportunity to document their crimes in real time, with multiple witnesses present. "I need to be there," I said. "Absolutely not. This is too dangerous. If they suspect you know anything about their operations, they could accelerate Nathan's conditioning, or worse." But I had already made my decision. Nathan was going to be paraded in front of strangers as proof of CrossTech's ability to transform human beings into corporate assets. I couldn't let that happen without fighting back. What if I was invited as Nathan's spouse? Wouldn't that seem natural for a company event showcasing employee success? Detective Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "It's risky, but it might be our only chance to document their methods with this many witnesses present. If you're willing to wear recording equipment and follow our exact instructions, it could work." That evening, I approached Nathan with careful casualness about the company event. His response was immediate and programmed. "The demonstration is restricted to essential personnel and invited corporate representatives," he said in his flat, emotionless tone. "Spouses are not included in the presentation parameters. But surely Vivian wouldn't mind if I attended to support you." This sounds like a big opportunity for CrossTech. Nathan's face went completely blank for several seconds, as if he was processing this request through some internal decision tree. When he spoke again, his voice carried a subtle note of confusion. "I will need to request permission from Dr. Cross regarding your attendance at the demonstration event." The fact that Nathan needed permission for me to attend a company function revealed how completely his autonomy had been stripped away. He couldn't make simple decisions about his personal life without approval from his handlers. The next morning, Nathan received a call from Marcus Vale approving my attendance. His excitement about my participation seemed genuine but mechanical, as if he'd been programmed to feel pleased about corporate recognition rather than experiencing authentic emotion. "Dr. Cross believes your presence will enhance the presentation impact," Nathan told me, repeating what was obviously Vale's exact phrasing. "Stable relationship dynamics are an important component of the optimization process." I spent the day preparing with Detective Rodriguez and her team. They fitted me with nearly invisible recording equipment and coached me on how to document what we witnessed without alerting CrossTech to my true purpose. The plan was for me to gather evidence while backup teams positioned themselves around the convention center, ready to intervene if necessary. "Remember, your safety is the priority," Detective Rodriguez emphasized. "If anything feels wrong, if you think they suspect you, get out immediately. We'll be monitoring your audio feed and can move in within minutes." That evening, Nathan dressed with unusual care, selecting a perfectly pressed suit and adjusting his appearance with meticulous attention to detail. His movements had the ritualistic quality of someone preparing for a performance rather than a business presentation. "You look handsome," I told him, searching his face for any flicker of the man who would have once smiled at the compliment. "Optimal presentation appearance is essential for successful demonstration outcomes," he replied, his tone suggesting he was quoting instructions rather than expressing personal thoughts. The Pearl District Convention Center buzzed with well-dressed professionals when we arrived. The event had been organized with impressive attention to detail, featuring elegant displays about CrossTech's corporate philosophy and sustainable business practices. To any casual observer, it appeared to be a standard corporate networking event, but I noticed details that revealed the true nature of the gathering. The attendees weren't random business professionals. They were CEOs and senior executives from major corporations, people with the authority to implement large-scale employee programs. Their conversations centered around workforce management challenges and the difficulty of maintaining employee loyalty in competitive markets. Vivian Cross moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her silver hair perfectly styled and her manner radiating confident authority. She wore a midnight blue dress that complemented her commanding presence, and her handshake conveyed the firm grip of someone accustomed to controlling every interaction. "Claire, how lovely that you could join us," she said when Nathan introduced us, her smile warm but calculating. "Nathan has been such an exceptional example of our development process. I thought it would be meaningful for you to see how much he's accomplished." Her words carried subtle implications that made my skin crawl. She was treating Nathan's psychological transformation as an achievement worthy of celebration, completely oblivious to the human cost of her experimentation. Marcus Vale appeared beside us with his characteristic clinical demeanor, studying both Nathan and me with analytical attention. "Nathan, your presentation readiness assessment shows optimal parameters. Are you prepared for the demonstration sequence?" "Fully prepared for all required protocols," Nathan responded immediately, his posture straightening as if he was receiving military orders. The ease with which Nathan shifted into this responsive mode was deeply disturbing. He'd been trained to react to specific verbal cues with immediate compliance, like a sophisticated piece of software responding to programming commands. The main presentation began in the convention center's largest conference room, with approximately 60 corporate executives, seated theater-style, facing a professionally lit stage. Vivian Cross opened with a polished introduction about the challenges of modern workforce management and the untapped potential of human resource optimization. "Traditional employee development focuses on skills, training, and performance incentives," she explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone presenting groundbreaking research. "But what if we could address the fundamental behavioral patterns that limit employee effectiveness? What if we could optimize human nature itself?" She clicked through slides displaying impressive statistics about productivity increases, reduced turnover rates, and enhanced employee compliance among CrossTech clients. The numbers were compelling, but I now understood they represented the systematic destruction of individual autonomy rather than genuine workplace improvement. "Tonight, you'll witness firsthand the results of our integrated personnel development model," Vivian continued. "Our demonstration subjects have undergone comprehensive behavioral optimization, resulting in measurable improvements across all performance metrics." Demonstration subjects. She was referring to human beings as laboratory specimens, and the audience was responding with keen interest rather than horror. These corporate leaders saw Nathan and others like him as potential assets to be acquired rather than people being abused. Marcus Vale took the stage next, presenting what he called the technical framework of their behavior modification process. His explanation was carefully sanitized, describing, quote, "guided personality development," and "optimized response training," without acknowledging the coercive nature of their methods. "The key breakthrough in our approach involves systematic environmental conditioning combined with targeted pharmaceutical support," he explained, clicking through diagrams that looked like military training protocols. "Subjects undergo graduated exposure to controlled stressors while receiving therapeutic interventions designed to suppress counterproductive behavioral patterns." I recognized the clinical language he was using to describe psychological torture. Environmental conditioning meant isolating victims from external support systems. Controlled stressors referred to deliberate psychological pressure designed to break down resistance. Therapeutic interventions was their euphemism for chemical manipulation and forced psychological modification. The audience asked technical questions about implementation timelines, cost structures, and measurable outcomes. Not one person expressed concern about the ethical implications of systematically altering human personalities. They were discussing the purchase of human beings as if they were evaluating software licenses or equipment leases. "Now for our live demonstration," Vivian announced, gesturing toward a side door. "Please welcome 3 of our optimization success stories." Nathan entered the stage along with 2 other men I didn't recognize, all moving with identical posture and measured steps. They positioned themselves in a precise line facing the audience, their expressions uniformly calm and attentive. The similarity of their demeanor was striking and unnatural, as if they'd been mass-produced rather than individually developed. "Gentlemen, please introduce yourselves and describe your experience with the optimization process," Vivian instructed. Nathan spoke first, his voice carrying across the room with perfect clarity and no trace of his natural speaking patterns. "I am Nathan Thornton, Senior Software Engineer at CrossTech Solutions. Prior to optimization, I experienced frequent workplace distractions, including personal relationship concerns, environmental activism, and resistance to corporate directives. The development process has eliminated these counterproductive behavioral patterns, resulting in enhanced focus and improved compliance with organizational priorities." The clinical precision of his self-description was horrifying. Nathan was describing his own personality destruction as if it was a successful medical procedure, completely unaware that his authentic self had been systematically murdered and replaced with this corporate automaton. The other 2 men delivered similar testimonials, describing their pre-optimization selves as flawed and problematic, while praising their current state of enhanced corporate dedication. Their wives sat in the audience, and I watched their faces carefully, looking for signs that they understood what had happened to their husbands. Most showed only pride and satisfaction, apparently believing their spouses had genuinely improved rather than been psychologically destroyed. But one woman, seated 3 rows ahead of me, looked deeply troubled. Her hands were clenched in her lap, and her face showed barely controlled distress as she listened to her husband describe his former interests and relationships as obstacles to professional success. "Now we'll demonstrate the enhanced responsiveness achieved through our conditioning protocols," Marcus Vale announced, stepping forward with what appeared to be a small remote device. "Subjects, assume readiness position." All 3 men immediately shifted into identical stances, their hands clasped behind their backs and their attention focused entirely on Vale. They looked like soldiers awaiting orders, their individuality completely subsumed into programmed uniformity. "Execute productivity enhancement sequence," Vale commanded. Nathan and the others began moving through a series of coordinated actions, pulling out phones, opening laptops, and beginning to type in perfect synchronization. Their movements were fluid but mechanical, demonstrating their ability to respond to commands with immediate, unquestioning compliance. The audience murmured appreciatively, clearly impressed by this display of human automation. Corporate executives were witnessing the transformation of independent human beings into programmable resources, and their primary reaction was professional envy rather than moral revulsion. "Subject optimization includes advanced loyalty protocols," Vivian explained as the men continued their synchronized demonstration. "Optimized personnel show zero interest in competing opportunities, external relationships that might compromise corporate dedication, or personal pursuits that don't align with organizational objectives." She was describing the complete elimination of human autonomy as a desirable feature. Nathan and the others had been stripped of their capacity for independent thought, personal relationships, and individual interests, transformed into corporate property disguised as employees. "Questions from the audience?" Vivian invited. A woman in an expensive suit raised her hand. "What about family relationships? How do you maintain the appearance of normal personal lives while ensuring corporate loyalty takes priority?" "Excellent question," Marcus Vale responded. "Family relationships are maintained at superficial levels, sufficient to avoid external scrutiny. But emotional attachments are systematically reduced to prevent conflicts with organizational priorities. Spouses typically interpret these changes as natural career development, rather than recognizing systematic modification." I felt physically sick listening to him describe how they'd deliberately destroyed Nathan's capacity to love me, while maintaining enough surface behaviors to keep me from realizing what was happening. My marriage had been systematically undermined as part of their psychological experimentation, and they were presenting this human devastation as innovative corporate strategy. Another executive asked about the legal implications of behavior modification programs. Vivian's response was chillingly casual. Our legal framework emphasizes voluntary participation in professional development programs, she explained. Subjects provide informed consent for optimization procedures, and all documentation presents the process as enhanced training rather than behavioral modification. Regulatory oversight is minimal in this area, and most jurisdictions lack specific protections against consensual personality development. Consensual personality development. They were using legal loopholes and deceptive language to justify what amounted to systematic psychological abuse of their own employees. Nathan had never consented to having his personality destroyed. He'd agreed to professional development training without understanding that it meant the elimination of his authentic self. The demonstration continued with additional displays of the men's programmed behaviors. They responded to verbal commands with immediate compliance, demonstrated emotional suppression when presented with formerly meaningful stimuli, and exhibited perfect recall of corporate policies while showing no memory of personal preferences or individual interests. The conditioning process is essentially irreversible after 18 months, Vale noted in response to a question about long-term stability. Neural pathways associated with pre-optimization personality patterns are systematically degraded and replaced with preferred behavioral frameworks. Subjects show no desire to return to their previous psychological states. Irreversible. After 18 months, the psychological damage became permanent. Nathan had been in their program for nearly 15 months, meaning I had perhaps 3 months to save whatever remained of his authentic self before the transformation became completely irreversible. The formal presentation concluded with Vivian inviting interested corporations to schedule private consultations about implementing their own optimization programs. The enthusiasm in the room was palpable, with multiple executives exchanging contact information and discussing potential pilot programs for their own employees. During the networking reception that followed, I moved through the crowd listening to conversations that revealed the scope of CrossTech's ambitions. They weren't planning to limit their psychological modification programs to their own employees. They intended to license their techniques to corporations throughout the country, potentially affecting thousands of workers who would unknowingly surrender their humanity in exchange for enhanced job performance. I approached the troubled woman I'd noticed earlier, introducing myself casually and steering our conversation toward our husband's involvement with CrossTech. Her name was Linda Morrison, and her husband David had been in the optimization program for nearly 2 years. David seems very focused on his work lately, I said carefully, testing whether she recognized the changes in her spouse. Focused is one way to put it, Linda replied, her voice tight with barely contained emotion. He used to be passionate about everything: art, music, travel, our children. Now it's like he's been replaced by someone who looks identical but feels completely different. Her words confirmed my suspicions about other victims and revealed that some family members were beginning to recognize the systematic nature of their loved ones' transformations. Linda had been living with a psychologically modified husband for 2 years, watching the man she'd married disappear piece by piece into this corporate automaton. "Have you talked to anyone about your concerns?" I asked. "Who would believe it? David's boss says he's never been more successful at work. His productivity scores are through the roof. He follows every company policy perfectly. From the outside, it looks like he's thriving." Linda's experience mirrored my own journey from confusion to growing horror, as I recognized that Nathan's workplace success was built on the systematic destruction of his authentic personality. CrossTech had perfected the art of human modification while maintaining plausible deniability about their methods. Our conversation was interrupted by Marcus Vale, who approached with his characteristic clinical smile and penetrating gaze. "Mrs. Thornton, I hope you're enjoying this evening's presentation," he said, his attention shifting between Linda and me with analytical interest. "It's always meaningful when family members can witness the positive outcomes of our development programs." "It's been very educational," I replied carefully, maintaining my cover while fighting the urge to confront him directly about what he'd done to Nathan. Nathan's progress has been particularly impressive, Vale continued. His adaptation to the optimization protocols exceeded our most optimistic projections. You must be very proud of his professional development. His words contained subtle threats disguised as compliments. He was letting me know that Nathan's conditioning was nearly complete, while gauging my reaction to determine whether I suspected the true nature of their program. Nathan has always been dedicated to his work, I said, choosing my words carefully. Indeed. Although I've noticed some recent behavioral anomalies that suggest potential external influences on his conditioning stability. Has he mentioned experiencing any unusual stress or conflicting loyalties recently? My blood ran cold. Vale was fishing for information about whether Nathan was showing signs of breaking free from their programming. He suspected that something was interfering with their control, and he was trying to determine whether I was the source of that interference. Nathan seems very focused on his responsibilities at CrossTech, I replied, maintaining neutral eye contact while my heart raced with fear. Excellent. Maintaining optimal conditioning requires minimizing external variables that might compromise subject stability. I trust you understand the importance of supporting Nathan's professional development without introducing unnecessary complications. His message was clear. Don't interfere with their control over my husband, or there would be consequences. Vale was warning me to stay away from Nathan, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about potential threats to their operation. Across the room, Nathan stood with the other demonstration subjects, all three men positioned with identical posture and vacant expressions. They looked like sophisticated robots powered down between performances, waiting for their next set of commands. The recording equipment hidden in my clothing had captured everything. Hours of documentation proving that CrossTech was conducting systematic psychological experiments on their employees, modifying human personalities for corporate profit, and selling their techniques to other companies interested in transforming their workforce into programmable resources. But as I watched Nathan standing motionless among his fellow victims, I realized that gathering evidence was only the beginning. CrossTech had turned my husband into a psychological laboratory specimen, and they were planning to do the same thing to thousands of other people. The demonstration tonight wasn't just about showcasing their current success. It was about recruiting new clients for a program that would systematically destroy human autonomy on an industrial scale. The networking reception continued around me, with corporate executives enthusiastically discussing implementation strategies and potential pilot programs. These business leaders were planning to purchase human modification techniques as casually as they might license new software or purchase office equipment. I needed to leave before my emotional control failed completely, but I also needed to extract Nathan from this environment before Vale's suspicions about my interference intensified. The delicate balance of maintaining my cover while gathering evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. As I approached Nathan to suggest we leave, Marcus Vale intercepted me again, his clinical smile more predatory than before. Mrs. Thornton, before you go, I'd like to schedule a consultation with you about optimizing your support role in Nathan's continued development, he said, his tone suggesting this wasn't really a request. What kind of consultation? Family integration is a crucial component of maintaining subject stability. Spouses who understand their role in reinforcing optimization protocols tend to produce better long-term outcomes. I think you'd benefit from some educational sessions about how to most effectively support Nathan's professional growth. Educational sessions. Vale was trying to recruit me into their program, either as a willing participant in Nathan's continued conditioning or as a subject for modification myself. He'd identified me as a potential threat to their control over Nathan, and his solution was to extend their psychological manipulation to include me. That sounds very thoughtful, I said, maintaining my facade while calculating escape routes. When would these sessions take place? We could begin as early as next week. I'll have my assistant contact you to arrange the initial assessment. Initial assessment? The same process Nathan had undergone before his personality destruction began. Vale was planning to subject me to the same psychological evaluation and conditioning protocols that had transformed my husband into a corporate automaton. I nodded politely while my mind raced with the implications. CrossTech had identified me as an obstacle to their complete control over Nathan, and their solution was to eliminate my resistance through the same systematic personality modification they'd used on him. If I allowed Vale to proceed with his educational sessions, I would become another demonstration subject at their next corporate presentation. The evening was ending, but my real fight against CrossTech was just beginning. The drive home from the convention center passed in tense silence. Nathan stared straight ahead through the windshield, his hands folded precisely in his lap, processing whatever post-demonstration protocols had been programmed into his conditioning. Occasionally, he would murmur fragments of corporate jargon under his breath, as if reviewing talking points for an exam he couldn't quite remember taking. "The presentation went well tonight," I said carefully, testing his responses while the recording equipment continued capturing our conversation. "Demonstration parameters were executed within acceptable variance ranges," Nathan replied without inflection. "Audience engagement metrics exceeded projected outcomes. Dr. Cross expressed satisfaction with performance quality. Even his assessment of the evening reduced human interaction to data points and efficiency measurements." The Nathan who would have once felt embarrassed or troubled by being displayed as a corporate achievement had been so thoroughly erased that he experienced no emotional response to his own exploitation. When we arrived at our loft, Nathan moved through his evening routine with mechanical precision, hanging his suit in the closet with exact spacing between hangers, organizing his presentation materials in perfectly aligned stacks, and checking his phone for what he called overnight directive updates. He had become a human machine, programmed for optimal corporate performance, but stripped of spontaneous thought or authentic emotion. I waited until Nathan disappeared into the bathroom for his evening hygiene protocols before contacting Detective Rodriguez through the secure communication system we'd established. The evidence I'd gathered tonight was explosive, documenting not just CrossTech's abuse of their current employees, but their active recruitment of new corporate clients interested in implementing identical psychological modification programs. "We have everything we need to move forward," Detective Rodriguez confirmed after reviewing the audio recordings. "Federal prosecutors are preparing warrants based on your documentation. We're coordinating with multiple agencies because this appears to involve interstate commerce violations, human trafficking charges, and potentially international conspiracy." The scope of the investigation had expanded far beyond Nathan's individual case. CrossTech's demonstration had revealed a systematic operation designed to transform corporate employees into psychological prisoners while generating massive profits from licensing their human modification techniques to other companies. The executives who'd attended tonight's presentation represented dozens of major corporations planning to purchase the ability to systematically destroy their employees' personalities. "We're moving tomorrow morning," Detective Rodriguez continued. "Federal agents will execute simultaneous warrants at CrossTech headquarters, Vivian Cross's residence, Marcus Vale's clinic, and several associated properties. We'll also be arresting anyone involved in the program's implementation. Tomorrow morning." After 15 months of watching Nathan disappear piece by piece into this corporate automaton, justice was finally within reach. But the timing also meant that tonight might be my last opportunity to reach whatever remained of my husband's authentic self before the legal intervention began. Nathan emerged from the bathroom wearing his precisely folded pajamas, his movements efficient but empty of personal warmth. He glanced at me with polite acknowledgement before settling into bed with the rigid posture of someone following a detailed checklist rather than naturally preparing for sleep. "Nathan," I said softly, moving to sit beside him on the edge of our mattress, "do you remember when we first met at the sustainability conference downtown?" His response came after a brief delay, as if he was accessing files from a corrupted database. "Meeting location, Portland Convention Center. Event classification, professional networking opportunity. Relationship initiation served strategic career development objectives." The memory that had once filled Nathan with joy and romantic nostalgia had been reprocessed through CrossTech's psychological conditioning into clinical corporate terminology. Even our love story had been stripped of emotion and reframed as a business transaction. "You wore that blue shirt with the environmental activism pins on the collar," I continued, hoping to trigger some buried recollection of his authentic self. "You were so passionate about using technology to fight climate change. You talked for 2 hours about solar panel efficiency algorithms." Nathan's face remained blank, but I noticed a slight twitch in his left eye, a micro-expression that suggested some deeper recognition was struggling against his programmed responses. Pre-optimization behavioral patterns included excessive focus on non-corporate environmental initiatives, he said slowly, his voice carrying a subtle note of confusion. Current priorities have been realigned to support organizational environmental objectives through approved channels. But something in his tone suggested internal conflict. The psychological conditioning that had suppressed his environmental passion wasn't completely stable. Somewhere beneath the layers of corporate programming, Nathan's authentic values were still fighting for recognition. I reached for his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his skin despite the emotional distance that separated us. Do you remember our wedding? The ceremony at the restored warehouse, with the locally sourced flowers? You cried during your vows because you said you'd found someone who understood your dreams. Nathan's breathing changed slightly, becoming less regulated and more natural. His eyes lost focus, as if he was trying to access memories that had been systematically suppressed, but not entirely destroyed. Wedding event occurred according to pre-established social protocols, he said, but his voice wavered with uncertainty. Emotional responses during ceremony were... He stopped speaking, his brow furrowing with concentration, as if he was trying to remember something important that remained just beyond his reach. For a moment, the corporate automaton flickered, and I caught a glimpse of the man I'd married struggling to break through the psychological barriers that had been constructed around his authentic self. Nathan, I love you, I said, squeezing his hand and willing him to feel the connection that CrossTech had tried to sever. The real you. Not this programmed version they've created. You're still in there somewhere, fighting to get out. His head turned toward me with sudden sharpness, his eyes focusing with an intensity I hadn't seen in months. Claire? The word came out as a question, as if he wasn't certain who I was or why my name felt significant. Yes, it's me. Your wife. The woman you chose to marry because we shared the same values and dreams for the future. I remember. Nathan's voice was barely audible, filled with confusion and dawning horror. There were sessions. Dr. Vale said they were for professional development, but they used lights and sounds and medications that made everything feel distant and strange. The conditioning was cracking. Nathan was beginning to access suppressed memories of the psychological manipulation he'd endured, breaking through the mental barriers that had kept him compliant and controlled. They did something to my mind, he continued, his voice growing stronger with recognition. I can remember agreeing to training sessions, but I can't remember what happened during them, and afterwards everything felt different. My thoughts, my feelings, even my dreams changed. I held his hand tighter, encouraging this breakthrough, while knowing that his recovery might be temporary. CrossTech's conditioning protocols were designed to suppress exactly this kind of awakening, and Nathan's programming could reassert itself at any moment. They've been controlling you for over a year, I explained gently. Systematic psychological manipulation designed to transform you into a corporate asset. But you're fighting back now. Your real self is still there. Nathan's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him in months. What have they done to me? I can barely remember who I used to be. Everything feels scripted, like I'm reading from someone else's playbook. Tomorrow, federal agents are going to arrest everyone involved in the program, I told him. Dr. Rodriguez and her team have been investigating CrossTech based on evidence I gathered. You're going to get help recovering from what they did to you. The mention of outside intervention triggered a visible change in Nathan's demeanor. His posture stiffened and his expression began shifting back toward the vacant compliance that had characterized his behavior for months. External interference with optimization protocols violates corporate security guidelines, he said, his voice returning to the flat, programmed tone. Unauthorized investigation activities must be reported to supervisory personnel immediately. The conditioning was reasserting itself, pulling Nathan back into the psychological prison that CrossTech had constructed around his authentic self. But this brief breakthrough had proven that his original personality still existed somewhere beneath the layers of programming, fighting for survival despite months of systematic suppression. Nathan, listen to me, I said urgently, trying to reach him before the corporate programming fully re-engaged. You don't have to report anything to anyone. You're not CrossTech's property. You're a human being with the right to think your own thoughts and make your own choices. But Nathan was already reaching for his phone, his movements mechanical and purposeful, as he prepared to contact his handlers and report this security breach. The conditioning included protocols for dealing with exactly this situation, automatic responses designed to protect CrossTech's control whenever subjects showed signs of psychological awakening. I couldn't let him make that call. If Nathan reported my investigation to Marcus Vale or Vivian Cross, they would accelerate his conditioning or relocate him before tomorrow morning's arrests. I might lose him permanently to their psychological manipulation, with no chance for recovery or justice. As Nathan began dialing, I made a decision that would haunt me regardless of its outcome. I grabbed the phone from his hands and switched it off, cutting the connection before he could report my activities to his corporate controllers. Nathan's reaction was immediate and disturbing. His entire body went rigid, and his breathing became rapid and shallow, as if he was experiencing a panic attack. His eyes darted around the room with desperate confusion, like a computer program encountering a critical error it couldn't resolve. Communication protocols require immediate reporting of security breaches, he said, his voice rising with agitation. Failure to maintain contact with supervisory personnel triggers emergency response procedures. There is no emergency, I said, trying to calm him while keeping the phone out of his reach. You're safe at home with your wife. Nobody is in danger. But Nathan's conditioning interpreted the inability to contact his handlers as a crisis requiring immediate action. He stood abruptly and moved toward our landline phone, his movements jerky and distressed as his programmed responses battled with his natural human instincts. I intercepted him before he could reach the phone, gently but firmly guiding him back to the bed. Nathan's confusion was heartbreaking, his face cycling through expressions of fear, anger, and bewilderment, as his psychological conditioning struggled with circumstances it hadn't been designed to handle. Claire, I need to make the call, he said, his voice filled with genuine desperation. Something terrible will happen if I don't report the security breach. I can feel it building inside my head like pressure that needs to be released. The psychological conditioning included pain responses designed to enforce compliance when subjects attempted to resist their programming. Nathan was experiencing genuine distress because his modified neural pathways were triggering stress reactions whenever he deviated from expected behaviors. The pressure isn't real, I explained, holding his hands to keep him grounded in physical reality. It's part of their control system. They've conditioned you to feel panic when you can't contact them, but it's artificial. You can fight through it. Nathan's breathing gradually slowed as he focused on my voice and the physical sensation of human contact that his conditioning hadn't been able to completely suppress. The crisis response programming began to subside, replaced by exhausted confusion as he struggled to understand what was happening to him. I don't know who I am anymore, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Sometimes I feel like myself, but most of the time I'm watching someone else live my life. Someone who looks like me but thinks corporate thoughts and feels corporate emotions. His description of his psychological state was eerily accurate. CrossTech had created a dual consciousness within Nathan's mind, with his authentic self imprisoned beneath layers of corporate programming that controlled his thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. The breakthrough moments were instances when his original personality managed to surface, despite the psychological barriers designed to suppress it. We spent the rest of the night talking, with Nathan alternating between periods of lucidity when his authentic self could communicate and episodes of programmed responses when the conditioning reasserted control. Each breakthrough provided more evidence of the systematic psychological abuse he'd endured, while also revealing the resilience of the human spirit under extreme manipulation. Nathan described fragmented memories of the conditioning sessions, recalling being placed in sensory deprivation chambers while listening to repeated corporate messaging designed to reshape his value system. He remembered receiving injections that he'd been told were vitamins, but that made him feel detached from his own thoughts and emotions. He recalled hours of psychological counseling with Marcus Vale that gradually eroded his ability to think independently about his life and relationships. They made me watch videos of myself, Nathan said during one particularly clear moment. Recordings of me expressing opinions or showing emotions they wanted to eliminate. Then they would show me modified versions where I said what they wanted me to say, felt what they wanted me to feel. Over and over until I couldn't remember which version was real. The sophistication of CrossTech's psychological manipulation was staggering. They had used advanced behavioral modification techniques combined with pharmaceutical intervention and environmental control to systematically deconstruct Nathan's personality and rebuild it according to corporate specifications. The process was so gradual and comprehensive that subjects lost the ability to recognize their own psychological transformation. As dawn approached, Nathan's periods of lucidity became shorter and less stable. The psychological conditioning was designed to reassert itself after periods of disruption, and his authentic self was being gradually suppressed again by the mental architecture that CrossTech had constructed around his consciousness. "I can feel myself disappearing again," Nathan said weakly, his voice fading as the corporate programming regained control. "It's like being pulled underwater. I can see the surface, but I can't reach it. Help is coming," I promised, though I wasn't certain how much of his original personality would survive until the legal intervention could begin his recovery process. "Federal agents are going to shut down CrossTech and arrest everyone involved in the program. You're going to get treatment to reverse what they've done to you." Nathan nodded, but his expression was already becoming vacant again as the conditioning protocols reasserted dominance over his consciousness. Within minutes, he had returned to the mechanical compliance that characterized his programmed state, moving through his morning routine with robotic efficiency while showing no memory of our night-long conversation about his psychological imprisonment. At 7:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Rodriguez. "Warrants executed. Arrests in progress. CrossTech operation shut down. Federal agents en route to your location for Nathan's protective custody." The investigation had moved into its final phase. CrossTech's psychological experimentation program was being dismantled, their corporate clients were being identified and investigated, and their victims were being taken into protective custody for treatment and recovery. But as I watched Nathan prepare for what he believed was another normal day at CrossTech, I realized that legal justice was only the beginning of his healing process. The psychological damage inflicted by months of systematic conditioning wouldn't be reversed by court orders or criminal convictions. Nathan's recovery would require intensive therapeutic intervention, and even then, some aspects of his personality modification might prove to be permanent. The man I'd married still existed somewhere within the corporate automaton that CrossTech had created, but reaching him would require patience, specialized treatment, and the hope that human resilience could overcome even the most sophisticated psychological manipulation. Our love story wasn't ending with tonight's revelations. It was beginning a new chapter focused on reclaiming the authentic self that had been stolen and systematically suppressed by people who viewed human consciousness as corporate property to be optimized for profit. When the federal agents arrived to take Nathan into protective custody, he complied with their instructions with the same mechanical obedience he'd shown toward all authority figures since his conditioning began. He didn't understand why he was being removed from his controlled environment, but his programming prevented him from questioning or resisting official directives. As they led him away for psychiatric evaluation and the beginning of his long recovery process, Nathan looked back at me with an expression that contained both recognition and confusion, as if he was trying to remember why this separation felt significant. "I'll be waiting for you," I called after him, not knowing whether my words reached his authentic self or simply registered as background noise in his programmed consciousness. The immediate crisis was over, but the real work of rebuilding our lives and helping Nathan reclaim his humanity was just beginning. 8 months after CrossTech's psychological experimentation program was exposed and dismantled, I stood in the observation room of the Pine Valley Treatment Center, watching Nathan work with Dr. Patricia Kim in what would be his final intensive therapy session. Through the one-way glass, I could see him sitting in a comfortable chair, his posture relaxed and natural for the first time since I'd known him. The mechanical rigidity that had characterized his movements for over a year had gradually dissolved, as the layers of corporate programming were systematically identified and addressed through specialized deprogramming techniques. The breakthrough came about 6 weeks ago, Dr. Kim explained, joining me at the observation window. Nathan began accessing preconditioning memories with increasing clarity and emotional authenticity. The pharmaceutical interventions CrossTech used to suppress his original personality have been completely metabolized out of his system, and the psychological barriers they constructed are finally dissolving. Nathan's recovery had been neither quick nor simple. The first few months of treatment involved intensive medical intervention to address the chemical dependencies CrossTech had created through their unmarked medications. Nathan had experienced withdrawal symptoms, memory fluctuations, and periods of severe disorientation as his brain chemistry gradually returned to its natural state. The psychological deprogramming process proved even more complex. Nathan's authentic personality had been systematically suppressed beneath layers of corporate conditioning that had to be carefully dismantled without causing additional psychological trauma. Dr. Kim and her team used specialized techniques developed for treating victims of extreme psychological manipulation, gradually helping Nathan distinguish between his genuine thoughts and emotions and the artificial responses that had been programmed into his consciousness. "He's been asking about you more frequently," Dr. Kim continued. "Not the scripted inquiries about household logistics that characterized his conditioned state, but authentic emotional questions about your relationship and his desire to reconnect with you as his genuine self." Through the glass, I watched Nathan engage in conversation with Dr. Kim with animated gestures and spontaneous expressions that reminded me of the man I'd fallen in love with 4 years ago. His face showed genuine emotion as he discussed his memories and feelings, no longer filtered through the corporate programming that had stripped him of authentic human responses. The legal proceedings against CrossTech had concluded 3 months earlier with comprehensive victories for the prosecution. Vivian Cross received a 28-year federal prison sentence for conspiracy, human trafficking, and operating an illegal psychological experimentation program. Marcus Vale was sentenced to 22 years for his role in developing and implementing the conditioning protocols. The corporate executives who had attended the demonstration event faced various charges related to conspiracy and attempted human trafficking, with several major corporations paying substantial settlements to avoid criminal prosecution. Nathan's testimony during the trials had been crucial for establishing the systematic nature of CrossTech's psychological abuse. As his authentic personality emerged through treatment, he was able to provide detailed accounts of the conditioning process, describing techniques and experiences that corroborated the evidence I had gathered during my investigation. His courage in confronting the people who had stolen his identity and transformed him into a corporate automaton helped ensure that justice was served not just for him, but for the dozens of other victims who had been subjected to similar psychological manipulation. The other demonstration subjects from that night at the convention center were also receiving treatment at specialized facilities throughout the country. Linda Morrison's husband David was making steady progress at a treatment center in California, gradually recovering memories and emotions that had been suppressed for over 2 years. The recovery process was different for each victim, depending on the duration and intensity of their conditioning, but all of them showed signs of authentic personality restoration when removed from CrossTech's controlled environment and provided with appropriate therapeutic intervention. My own life had undergone profound transformation during Nathan's recovery period. I had resigned from my position at Henderson Creative to establish the Cognitive Freedom Legal Foundation, an organization dedicated to representing victims of workplace psychological manipulation and pushing for legislative protections against corporate abuse of employee autonomy. The Foundation's first cases involved representing other CrossTech victims in civil litigation against the corporation and its affiliated companies, securing settlements that provided funding for their ongoing treatment and recovery. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful. Each case revealed new aspects of how sophisticated psychological manipulation could be disguised as legitimate business practices, and how easily corporate power could be used to systematically destroy individual autonomy. The Foundation's advocacy had contributed to new federal legislation, specifically addressing psychological manipulation in workplace environments, creating legal protections that hadn't existed when Nathan first fell victim to CrossTech's experimentation. "Claire?" Nathan's voice came through the intercom system connecting the observation room to Dr. Kim's office. "I know you're there. Can we talk?" Dr. Kim nodded, indicating that Nathan was ready for this conversation. His ability to sense my presence and directly request communication represented significant progress from the man who had needed permission from his corporate handlers to make simple decisions about his personal life. I entered the therapy room feeling a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Nathan and I had maintained limited contact during his recovery, following Dr. Kim's recommendation that he needed space to rediscover his authentic self without the pressure of fulfilling relationship expectations based on his conditioned behaviors. This would be our first substantial conversation since his personality had begun emerging from beneath the layers of corporate programming. "Hi," Nathan said simply, his voice carrying warmth and genuine recognition that I hadn't heard in over a year. "You look good, different, but good. Stronger, I think." "Thank you," I replied, settling into the chair across from him. "You look like yourself again. The real you, not the version they created." Nathan nodded, his expression mixing gratitude with lingering sadness. Dr. Kim has helped me understand how systematically they dismantled my personality and rebuilt it according to their specifications. It's terrifying to realize how completely I lost myself, but also amazing to discover that my authentic self survived, despite everything they did to suppress it. We talked for nearly 2 hours, with Dr. Kim facilitating our conversation, while allowing us the space to reconnect naturally. Nathan described his memories of our early relationship with emotional clarity that had been absent during his conditioned state. He remembered our shared environmental values, our late-night conversations about building meaningful careers, and the genuine love that had motivated his proposal and our wedding. "I need you to know that the person who became distant and emotionally unavailable wasn't me," Nathan said at one point, tears evident in his eyes. "They systematically destroyed my capacity for authentic relationships while maintaining just enough surface behavior to prevent anyone from recognizing what was happening. I never stopped loving you, Claire. They just buried that love so deeply that I couldn't access it or express it." His words provided healing for wounds I hadn't fully acknowledged during the long months of watching him disappear into corporate programming. I had questioned whether Nathan's withdrawal was somehow my fault, whether I had failed as a wife by not recognizing the signs of his transformation sooner, or fighting harder to maintain our connection. "I should have realized what was happening to you earlier," I said. "I saw the changes but couldn't understand their significance until it was almost too late." "You saved me," Nathan replied firmly. "Your investigation and willingness to risk everything to expose CrossTech gave me the chance to recover my authentic self. Without your courage, I would have been permanently lost to their programming." Dr. Kim guided us through discussions about the future of our relationship, acknowledging that both of us had been profoundly changed by our experiences with CrossTech's psychological manipulation. I had developed new strengths and professional focus during my fight to expose their crimes, while Nathan was rediscovering interests and passions that had been suppressed for over a year. "Rebuilding your marriage will require patience and realistic expectations," Dr. Kim explained. "You're essentially getting to know each other again, because both of you have grown and changed through this traumatic experience. The foundation of love and shared values that originally brought you together is still there, but you'll need to develop new ways of relating that account for who you've both become." Nathan and I spent the following weeks reconnecting gradually, starting with simple activities that allowed us to rediscover our compatibility without the pressure of resuming our full married life immediately. We took walks through the same Portland neighborhoods where we'd courted 4 years earlier, visited familiar restaurants and bookstores, and gradually rebuilt the emotional intimacy that CrossTech's conditioning had systematically undermined. The man who emerged from his psychological recovery was recognizably the Nathan I'd fallen in love with, but enhanced by his traumatic experience rather than diminished by it. His environmental passion had returned with increased intensity, motivated by his first-hand understanding of how corporate power could be used to manipulate and control human beings. His gentleness and humor had survived the conditioning process, but he'd also developed a strength and determination that came from having fought his way back from psychological imprisonment. "I want to use my experience to help other victims," Nathan told me during one of our evening conversations. "Dr. Kim thinks I could be effective as a peer counselor for people recovering from similar psychological manipulation. I understand what it feels like to lose yourself completely and then fight to reclaim your authentic identity." His desire to transform his trauma into service for others aligned perfectly with my own advocacy work through the Cognitive Freedom Legal Foundation. We began developing programs that combined legal support for psychological manipulation victims with peer counseling services provided by people who had successfully recovered from similar experiences. 6 months after Nathan's discharge from Pine Valley Treatment Center, we held a small ceremony to renew our wedding vows. The event took place in the same restored warehouse where we'd originally married, but this time our understanding of commitment was deeper and more conscious. We weren't just promising to love each other through ordinary challenges, but specifically acknowledging our shared commitment to protecting each other's autonomy and authentic selfhood against any force that might threaten our individual freedom. I choose you not because I need you to complete me, but because I want to build a life with someone who sees and values my authentic self, Nathan said during his vows, his words carrying weight earned through nearly losing his identity completely. I choose you because you fought your way back to yourself despite overwhelming obstacles, and because I know you'll support me in remaining true to myself no matter what pressures we face, I replied, thinking of the long journey that had brought us to this moment of renewed commitment. The ceremony was attended by other CrossTech survivors and their families, creating a community of people who understood the unique challenges of rebuilding relationships after experiencing systematic psychological manipulation. Dr. Kim served as our officiant, emphasizing the significance of choosing authentic connection after surviving attempts to destroy individual autonomy. Nathan's recovery wasn't complete, and probably never would be entirely. He occasionally experienced what Dr. Kim called echo responses, brief moments when CrossTech's programming would resurface under stress, causing him to revert temporarily to corporate jargon or mechanical behaviors. But these episodes became less frequent over time, and Nathan developed skills for recognizing and interrupting them before they could affect his authentic thinking. The Cognitive Freedom Legal Foundation continued expanding its services, representing victims of psychological manipulation from various corporate and institutional settings. Nathan joined the organization as Director of Survivor Services, using his experience to develop support programs for people recovering from different forms of coercive control. His work proved invaluable for helping other victims understand that recovery was possible, and that their authentic selves could survive even the most sophisticated psychological manipulation. 2 years after CrossTech's exposure, Congress passed the Cognitive Liberty Protection Act, federal legislation that specifically criminalized workplace psychological manipulation, and created oversight mechanisms to prevent corporations from conducting unauthorized behavior modification programs on their employees. The law included provisions for victim compensation and mandatory reporting requirements for mental health professionals who suspected psychological manipulation in workplace settings. Nathan and I testified before Congress during the legislative hearings, sharing our story to illustrate how easily sophisticated psychological manipulation could be disguised as legitimate employee development programs. Nathan's testimony was particularly powerful because he could describe the conditioning process from the victim's perspective, explaining how gradually his authentic self had been suppressed and replaced with corporate programming. The most insidious aspect of psychological manipulation is that victims lose the ability to recognize what's happening to them, Nathan told the congressional committee. I believed I was becoming more successful and professionally focused, not realizing that my capacity for independent thought and authentic relationships was being systematically destroyed. Without external intervention from people who loved me enough to fight for my recovery, I would have been permanently lost. Our marriage continued growing stronger as we learned to support each other's ongoing healing, while building a shared life dedicated to protecting other people's cognitive freedom. Nathan's experience with psychological manipulation made him deeply committed to preserving individual autonomy, while my investigative work during his conditioning had taught me the importance of vigilance against institutional abuse of power. We never had children, partly because Nathan's recovery required ongoing attention, and partly because we felt called to focus our nurturing energy on helping other survivors of psychological manipulation. The Cognitive Freedom Legal Foundation became our shared legacy, an organization that helped dozens of families reunite with loved ones who had been lost to various forms of coercive control. Nathan's mysterious phone calls had stopped the night federal agents arrested Vivian Cross and Marcus Vale, But the impact of those calls continued rippling through our lives, and the lives of everyone we were able to help through our advocacy work. What had begun as a wife's growing concern about her husband's changing behavior had evolved into a movement dedicated to protecting human consciousness from corporate exploitation. The man who answered those calls at 2:47 a.m. had been a victim of sophisticated psychological manipulation, but the man who survived that experience became a powerful advocate for cognitive freedom and authentic human connection. Our love story wasn't destroyed by CrossTech's intervention, but transformed into something deeper and more conscious than what we'd originally shared. Sometimes, late at night when Nathan would stir in his sleep, I would remember those long months of watching him disappear into corporate programming and feel grateful for the strength that had carried us through that darkness. The mysterious calls had changed everything, but ultimately they had led us to a deeper understanding of love, resilience, and the irreplaceable value of authentic human connection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.